Right now on Upfront.
A new era.
We don't need to fix what isn't broken. We need to build on what works.
Devin Remiker, the new chair of the state Democratic Party. Now, his first days on the job, the attention turning to 2026, the midterms, and the Democratic candidates already announcing.
We know that if we were able to flip that number, we can actually start funding K-12 education.
This Sunday, our one-on-one, the new party chairman's challenges, and the new plans to win back Wisconsin voters.
Scathing report. The Wisconsin Elections Commission blasting Madison's former city clerk after failing to count nearly 200 absentee ballots in November. Now their critical findings ahead of a commission vote this week. Ann Jacobs, chair of the Wisconsin Elections Commission, is with us first.
Some big, beautiful bill blowback.
Rome wasn't built in a day, but I think you're going to see a lot of great progress very quickly.
The Trump administration selling the massive legislation. U.S. House members back home this past week, and Democrats looking to seize upon it. Congressman Brian Stile on his vote moments away.
This is Upfront with Jaron Jordan and political director Matt Smith.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. The state budget now done. Now all the talk turning to the midterms.
Wisconsin businessman Bill Berrien officially launching his Republican bid for governor, releasing this video Wednesday. He joins Washington County Executive Josh Schoemann so far on the Republican side, all while Democrats await a decision from Governor Tony Evers on whether he'll seek a third term. The governor had this to say this past week.
I don't know, a couple of weeks maybe.
Is there a strong possibility that you could run now that the budget is
Well,
done? It's a hot topic.
To me, there's two options. Thank God there's not 10.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll get it done.
All right, so the state parties both already preparing for 2026, including the new chairman of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin, Devin Remiker, who we caught up with this week in Manitowoc County. These factory towns, I mean, you can name them all across Wisconsin. They used to probably have a lot of Democratic voters. Yeah. I mean, do you know people either in your family or friends who worked here who were Democratic voters and now may have voted for Trump in recent years?
Yeah. So, both my grandfathers worked here. Both of them worked here most of their working lives after they left the military. Each of them had their 25-year service medal that I saw displayed on their shelves somewhere. And I know at least one of them, did vote for Trump in 2016. And interestingly enough, he voted for Biden in 2020. But I think that, sort of losing touch with that working class voter, losing touch with what the concerns were.
We met the new Democratic Party of Wisconsin chair, Devin Remiker, in his hometown, Two Rivers, just outside what used to be the old Hamilton factory, a once booming factory town Remiker sees as symbolic for what Democrats in the state need to win back.
You probably remember when I was a kid, I would
Remiker took us to Connie's Diner, where his mom was once a waitress, and where he'd sit at the counter as a kid and order a cheeseburger and fries.
The conversations that happen in this diner, I think are the type of things that I really want to make sure the Democratic Party of Wisconsin is focused on making sure that we have a toehold into, that we are able to equip people to be able to have conversations, not just at doors, but in everyday life, and help reach people more effectively, especially working class people. And I think that's a place where our party has room to improve, is making sure that we are reaching out to working class voters with a consistent, disciplined economic message with an optimistic vision for the future.
Have Democrats, in a sense, lost that a little bit, those diner conversations?
I think so. I think that we may not have made any sort of conscious decision or effort, but I think that over time, we have lost trust with working class voters. I mean, here in Manitowoc County, 2016 was the first presidential election where, I believe since Lyndon Johnson, where someone won with more than 55% of the vote. We used to be a very close county here in Manitowoc County. And then after that, in 2020, I believe Trump got 60% of the vote, which hadn't happened since Eisenhower in this county. And I really think that this county is representative of what we need to do as a party to reach out to working class voters around this state and win them back. My goal as state party chair isn't to win coin flips for the fate of democracy in a battleground state perpetually. I want to be a blue state. And to do that, we're going to need to win some people back that we have lost.
The 33-year-old says his goal is to reach voters the Democratic Party has not.
Hey, I'm Devin Remaker. It's my first day on the job, and I'm honored to serve as the new chair of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin.
Remaker recently recording his first TikTok as party chairman in an ever-changing political world. When you look at the numbers, the Marquette poll here in Wisconsin, for example, 60% say they have an unfavorable view of the party, 70% of independents. I mean, that has to keep you up at night.
Certainly. I mean, I think that there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the political party system in the United States right now, and I want to lead a Democratic Party of Wisconsin that people can believe in again. And insofar as I can do that in a way that helps restore faith in the party writ large nationally and show other folks how we can do that at scale, I'm excited for the opportunity to do so.
It seems like we've kind of seen this clash nationally, at least, in terms of some Democrats saying, you're not going hard enough against Trump. You're not going hard enough against the administration. We want Democrats to push back even more. What do you see the role as Wisconsin Democrats in that conversation?
Yeah, I definitely think that we need to be fighting back. And
even more?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, right now I think a lot of people's perception of the Democratic Party, even amongst our own members, is that we are not front and center in the fight right now. That in the early days of the Trump administration, national Democrats didn't rise to the occasion and were able to fight back against the Trump administration. And I think that's something that we have to do. I mean, this isn't, for some people just about issues. It's about their life, their freedom, their safety. And I think that making sure that we are present, we are speaking out loudly and clearly is incredibly important. And I also think that that is part of what made Trump successful, was that people who were mad as heck about what they saw as their community changing, their way of life changing, their economic situation changing, they saw someone who was mad and willing to fight back. And I think that voters want to know that somebody is on their side, and not just on their side when it's convenient, but willing to throw a punch for them too.
The immediate attention turns to the midterms, the governor's race, and Democrats' push to gain seats, and with new maps even win majorities in the legislature, specifically targeting the state Senate next year. I mean, do you want the governor to seek re-election as the party chairman?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, no, Governor Evers has done a fantastic job as governor for the state of Wisconsin. And he's had a really hard job. I mean, what he has had to deal with, particularly the COVID pandemic, I mean, that was just an unprecedented challenge. I think he's been a terrific leader. I pray that he decides to seek re-election. But either way, I know that the Democratic Party of Wisconsin will be in a great position to ensure he's either re-elected or re-elected Democrat in 2026.
What insight do you have? Everyone's wondering.
I have nothing. I got nothing for you. I'm on pins and needles.
What does that do, though, just in terms from a structural perspective, in terms of the party fundraising? Is it a big deal whether the governor seeks re-election or there is a Democratic primary?
Certainly. I mean, Governor Evers has been a fantastic partner to the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. He's even put on pause his own election efforts to help fundraise for some of our state legislative work on cycles where he hasn't been on the ballot. And he's a tremendous fundraiser. And I think that when you look at what happens in a scenario where he doesn't run for re-election, there's certainly going to be plenty of other folks that are out there trying to raise money.
I think nationally, a lot of Democrats looked to the state party under Ben and said, wow, look at the money they're raising, look at the fundraising that Ben is doing. Are you going to be able to do the same?
Well, I am really excited by the first couple of weeks here. I've had a ton of conversations with folks. I've worked closely with Ben through the past 6 years and with Chair Lanning before him as well, which is where a lot of our major donor giving actually started. And people kind of undercount that, but some of the first significant contributions started under Chair Lanning. Chair Wickler helped pour gasoline on the whole thing. And I think that somewhat uniquely, having worked with him so closely and been part of building that, these donors, large and grassroots, they largely are investing in an operation that they trust. They trust us to make the change that they believe in. And as someone who has been part of that team and building that trust, I am very confident in already seeing that be carried through into my tenure as chair.
When we look to the legislature, beyond the governor's race, this will be big as well, just in terms of who controls the Assembly and Senate. In terms of resources, you don't have unlimited resources. Is the first target the Senate, winning back the Senate, and then maybe trying to invest in the Assembly, or what's your strategy on legislative races?
So I am really looking forward to the opportunity in 2026 to be able to spread Republicans pretty thin. And I don't think that you can just come into races at the end of the cycle and start investing and bring them online. I don't view it as, okay, you start with this, then you go to this. You have to look at the big board and make sure that you are essentially putting in place, planting all the seeds that you want to grow later on. So I think that we're going to be looking pretty deep into the Republican, district bench in both the Assembly and the Senate to open up more opportunities. I truly think that in 2026, Republicans will realize they have made a grave mistake in betraying Wisconsinites and the American people with what they have done, and we're going to make them pay for it by winning as many elections as possible in the Assembly and the Senate.
What are the odds Democrats take the Senate?
I'm feeling pretty good.
All right, coming up, the blistering new report. The city of Madison failing to count nearly 200 absentee ballots in November. Now the scathing new details outlined in a new report from the Wisconsin Elections Commission. The commission's chair, Ann Jacobs, with the findings next.